Good day, everyone. We will be discussing in this lesson the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. The cells of the body require an endless supply of oxygen to carry out metabolism. And this is because oxygen is needed by the cells of the body to perform catabolic reactions or oxidations, which eventually will produce adenosine triphosphate. As the cells use oxygen, they give off carbon dioxide that the body must get rid of. So in essence, in metabolism, carbon gets oxidized to form carbon dioxide. And that removal of electrons will power the gradient that will produce adenosine triphosphate. The cardiovascular and the respiratory systems share the responsibility of supplying the body with oxygen and disposing carbon dioxide. The respiratory system, in particular, will oxygenate the blood and remove carbon dioxide from the blood, and the cardiovascular system will be the one responsible for circulating the blood so that it carries with it and delivers to the cells oxygen and nutrients and takes away from the cells carbon dioxide and metabolic wastes. The organs of the respiratory system include the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and the lungs. And we place our division here in the larynx, where everything proximal to the larynx will be the upper respiratory tract, and everything distal to the larynx will be the lower respiratory tract. So since these are organs, these are made up of different tissues which help each other to perform a particular function. You have to take note that throughout the respiratory tract, gas exchange only occurs in structures with alveoli. The rest are just conducting passageways. So oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange with the blood and the air only occurs in regions of the respiratory tract with alveoli, in particular the distal tract of the lungs. The larynx divides the tract into an upper and a lower respiratory tract. So, if gas exchange only occurs in the alveoli, what then is the function of the rest of the organs? These organs or conducting passages serve to purify, humidify, and warm the inhaled air so that there is no irritation of the respiratory membrane. So this picture shows you the major respiratory organs shown in relation to surrounding structures. Here would be the region of the nose, and you will appreciate that what you see from the outside would only be the nostril and the nose, and there is a larger cavity behind or posterior the nostril, and this is your nasal cavity. You have here the oral cavity or the space of the mouth, the pharynx or the throat, the larynx or the voice box, the trachea, which eventually bifurcates at the region of the carina into a right and left primary bronchus. Then you have the lung, enclosed in a sac that is analogous to the pericardium called the pleura, being the sac. And you have here the diaphragm, which is the primary muscle of respiration. Air enters the nose by passing through the nares, or otherwise known as the nostril. The nasal cavity, which is the space posterior to the nares, is separated in the midline by the nasal septum. The nasal septum is made up of bone and cartilage. So it separates the nasal cavity into a right and left chamber. You might have recalled that the nose is important for the sensation of smell, and that is because at the roof of the nasal cavity, there are olfactory receptors, which are technically the ends of neurons that penetrate the inferior aspect of the ethmoid bone, which is a bone in the skull. So you can imagine that these olfactory receptors penetrate the bone, and from there, neurons will emerge and connect into the brain, which will allow you to perceive the sense of smell. The nasal cavity is separated from the oral cavity by the palate. So the space of the nose is separated from the space of the mouth by the palate, which is made up of a hard palate and a soft palate. The hard palate is more anterior and it is made up of bone, while the soft palate is more posterior and it is made up of mucosa and muscle. Furthermore, the nasal cavity is surrounded by hollow structures or spaces called paranasal sinuses. So the term paranasal means around the nose, paranasal. These paranasal sinuses are located in the bones of the skull, and in particular, we find them in the frontal bone, the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, and the maxillary bone. So these are technically just hollow spaces lined with respiratory mucosa situated in the bone. So this picture shows you the relative locations of the different paranasal sinuses. You have here located in the frontal bone, the frontal sinus, located in the ethmoid bone, the ethmoid sinus, located in the maxillary bone or the cheek bone, you have the maxillary sinus, and located more posteriorly and deeply into the skull, the sphenoid sinus, which is located in the sphenoid bone, which forms the base of the skull. Let's now go into the pharynx or the throat. The pharynx has three regions: the nasopharynx, which is posterior to the nasal cavity, the oropharynx, which is posterior to the oral or mouth cavity, and the laryngopharynx, which is posterior to the larynx. There is a particular structure which connects the middle ear into the nasopharynx. And so you have to understand that from this structure, there is a physical connection between the throat and the ear. This is your eustachian tube, or otherwise known as the pharyngotympanic tube. So that if you have, for example, an upper respiratory tract infection which started in your nose, it traveled into your throat, and eventually that infection can travel through the tube into the middle ear. In the pharynx, there are clusters of lymphatic tissue called tonsils. So this picture shows you the regions of the pharynx. And this entire region here, posteriorly located, would be the pharynx or the throat. And you will appreciate from this picture that the nasopharynx is posterior to the nasal cavity. The oropharynx is posterior to the oral cavity, and this is your tongue. And the laryngopharynx is posterior to the larynx. This picture, although a little bit crowded, shows you the more detailed anatomy of the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, the larynx, and the pharynx. So let's start here. More anteriorly, you have here the frontal sinus, which is a part of the paranasal sinus system. You have here the space posterior to the nares, which is your nasal cavity. And you will find here projections from the walls of the nasal cavity called nasal concha or nasal concha. So this concha will cover particular spaces called meatai or meatus. So if your projection is the concha, the ridge or the depression on the nasal cavity wall would be your meatus. So like the concha, you have superior, middle, and inferior concha. You also have your superior, middle, and inferior meatus. So what is the purpose of the concha? This will increase the surface area coated by respiratory mucosa, and this will serve to purify the air that goes more posteriorly, as well as humidify it, okay, or add water into the air so that the air is not dry. Okay. On the other hand, the meatuses are common drainage locations. So the paranasal sinuses, which contains secretions, uh, together with the eye, the secretions of the eye, they will drain into the nasal meatus. And eventually, as they drain into the meatus, they will be collected here, where you can swallow it or spit it out. Okay? This would be the base of the skull. And here in the base of the skull, you have a particular bone system called the ethmoid bone. And perforations of the ethmoid bone um, identify the portion of the ethmoid bone called the cribriform plate. So this is where your olfactory receptors are found. So you can imagine that the sense of smell is subserved by smell or odorants going up to the nasal cavity and reaching the roof of the nasal cavity. Okay, this is your sphenoid bone, and this is where in the sphenoid bone you will find the pituitary gland, and this is your sphenoid sinus. Okay, the nasal cavity has a posterior nasal aperture, which we also call the choana. Okay, this region here is also known as the choana. So here you have the nasopharynx, and what particular structures can we find in the nasopharynx? You have here the pharyngeal tonsil, otherwise known as the adenoid tonsil. This is the opening of the pharyngotympanic tube, which is the eustachian tube and connects the ear to the throat. This is the uvula, which you can appreciate when you open your mouth. And the uvula is part of your soft palate. And this is your hard palate, okay, which continues anteriorly as the alveoli of the maxillary teeth. Okay, so the hard palate is continuous with the soft palate, and the palate system separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. Then you have here the oropharynx. And what can you find in the oropharynx? You have the palatine tonsils. So this is a ring of tonsillar tissue or lymphoid tissue that guards the outro of the oral cavity into the pharynx. So you will find here the palatine tonsils, which are made up of white blood cells, and the lingual tonsils, also made up of white blood cells, and posteriorly located to the tongue. You have here the tongue, which is a muscular structure. And then let's go more inferiorly. This is your larynx, and we have a separate discussion of this later. You have here the epiglottis, which covers or uncovers depending on what function is being subserved. For example, when you are breathing, the epiglottis is open so that air can travel. But when you are about to swallow food, the epiglottis closes so that food does not go into the respiratory tract and goes into the digestive tract. So when there is a deficient function of the epiglottis, you can choke because food, instead of going here posteriorly, will go anteriorly into the respiratory tract. This is your thyroid cartilage, whose anterior fusion of the lamina forms the Adam's apple. This is your vocal fold, which vibrates um, and resonates with the air so that sound can be produced for speaking. And then you have here the ring structure of the larynx, which is your cricoid cartilage. Then posterior to it would be the laryngopharynx, and continuous with the laryngopharynx or the hypopharynx is the esophagus. So this picture shows you the tonsillar ring, okay, or the tonsillar ring of Waldeyer. So this tonsillar ring guards the um, region that connects the oral cavity with the oropharynx. So you have here the palatine tonsils, and this is what we usually see as enlarged and inflamed in patients who have palatine tonsillitis. Okay, and then posterior to the tongue would be the lingual tonsil, and then um, tonsils that guard the opening of the uh, eustachian tube connected with the uh, torus tubarius, or the tube structure of the throat, which are technically muscles. You have the tubal tonsils, and superiorly located, you have the adenoid or the pharyngeal tonsil. So again, the tonsillar ring guards the oral cavity, and they are made up of different tonsils: the adenoid, the tubal tonsil, the palatine tonsil, and the lingual tonsil. And then you can find it here in this picture uh, as your sagittal section view. So superior to inferior, you have adenoid, tubal, palatine, and then lingual. Now let's proceed to our discussion of the larynx. The larynx, or the voice box, is important for routing air and food into the proper tract, food into the digestive tract, and air into the respiratory tract. And this purpose is subserved by the epiglottis. The larynx, or the voice box, is also essential in speech production and sound production. Thus, it is called the voice box. The larynx is actually actually a combination of 8 different cartilages. The largest cartilage is the thyroid cartilage, whose lamina, or big surface, protrudes anteriorly and meets in the middle. And that meeting in the middle is what is seen superficially as the Adam's apple. The mucous membrane lining the cavity of the larynx on the internal surface of the larynx folds to form the vocal cords, which vibrates with expelled air. So the frequency of the vibration as it is being hit by the expelled air produces the sound. So if you have a higher frequency of vibration, you will have a higher pitch of the sound. And if you have slower vibration or a lower frequency of vibration, it will produce a lower pitch of the sound. So this would be the surface anatomy uh, of the voice box. So you have here the hyoid bone, which is a floating bone in the neck. And there is a membrane that connects from the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone, and this is your thyrohyoid membrane. This is the thyroid cartilage, and it meets anteriorly and in the midline to produce the thyroid prominence, otherwise known as the Adam's apple. So there is also a depression going inferiorly of the thyroid lamina, and this is your thyroid notch. Okay, and then this is a oblique line on the thyroid cartilage. Okay, and then as we go inferiorly, we will encounter another cartilage of the larynx, which is your cricoid cartilage. Okay, so your cricoid cartilage is connected to the thyroid cartilage through this one. This is your cricothyroid membrane or cricothyroid ligament. And then as you go more inferiorly, you will now encounter the trachea. So this is another view of the different cartilages and structures of the larynx. Again, this is the hyoid bone, and what this picture shows you would be the relative position of the epiglottis to the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone, and the cricoid cartilage relative to the thyroid cartilage and the trachea. Okay, so there is a membrane that connects the hyoid to the epiglottis. And you will appreciate that um, if, for example, you are swallowing food, the epiglottis will fold posteriorly to cover the entrance of air so that food does not go into the respiratory tract. This joint, the cricothyroid joint, is how the thyroid cartilage connects to the cricoid cartilage. So the cricoid cartilage is the strongest cartilage in the larynx, and it prevents um, the passage of air from folding onto itself so that it does not collapse, because this is again the hardest cartilage. So it provides the structural support of the voice box. If we will be viewing the inner aspect or inner surface of the larynx, this is what we will see. Okay, so this is the epiglottis, and again it folds over this region so that air does not mix with the food. Okay, and this would be the inner aspect of the larynx, and you have here a lot of mucosa. So the true vocal cord will be this one. This is your vocal fold. And air from the trachea will move past through this and cause this one to vibrate. And depending on the tension of the vocal fold, the air will vibrate also with a particular frequency. The higher the tension, much like the string of a guitar, the higher the frequency of vibration in the air and the higher the pitch. Okay, so this is your rima glottidis or opening of the vocal fold. This is your rima vestibuli or opening of the vestibular fold, and this is your interarytenoid fold. Okay, so these two structures here, the cuneiform tubercle and the corniculate tubercle, are portions of the um, arytenoid cartilage. Okay? That is why this region here is called the interarytenoid fold. And this picture on the right shows you the sagittal section of the larynx, and it also shows you that the internal surface of the larynx is covered by this pink membrane here. This is your respiratory membrane. The trachea serves as air conduit from the larynx and into the bronchi, which eventually branches to direct the flow of air into the alveoli. The trachea is a cartilaginous structure, which means it is made up of hyaline cartilage, a strong type of cartilage. And that cartilage is arranged as rings, okay? But the rings are not complete rings. Posteriorly, there is a defect in the cartilage, so it is not a complete ring, and that bridge is gapped by a muscle called the trachealis muscle. The inner lining of the trachea houses cells with hair structures, ciliated epithelium. These hair structures beat the mucus that lines the respiratory tract away from the lungs and towards the mouth. So the inner lining of the trachea has hairy cells whose hair beats the mucus towards the mouth, so that the mucus that is deep into the lungs catches particles and bacteria, and the particles and the bacteria stick into the mucus, and as the mucus is being beat towards the mouth, it eventually reaches the mouth where it is either swallowed or spitted out. Anatomically, the trachea is anterior to the esophagus, or posterior to the trachea is the esophagus. So again, the trachea is encountered first as you go from anterior to posterior. And this is another view of the trachea. This time, it is a cross section. So you have here the trachea. And again, the trachea is not a complete ring of cartilage. The cartilage is only this one. And what connects the cartilage to form a circular structure would be a muscle called the trachealis muscle. The inner lining of the trachea, or the lumen of the trachea, is lined with ciliated epithelium. And if you will look at the ciliated epithelium through a scanning electron microscope, this is what you will see. There are literally hair-like cilia or structure, and the mucus will be in here, and this will beat towards the mouth. So from here, it will ascend to the mouth, the mucus. Okay? And posterior to the trachea would be your esophagus. The primary bronchi are formed by the division of the trachea. So again, the trachea bifurcates into two bronchi, left bronchus and right bronchus. The bronchi moves obliquely and enters the medial depression of the lungs called the pulmonary hilum. So the region of the lung that is nearer to the midline is called the pulmonary hilum, and it is where the bronchi penetrates the lung, and it is also where the pulmonary vessels, pulmonary artery, and pulmonary vein enter and exit the lung. Please take note of this. The right bronchus is wider, shorter, and straighter than the left. So the right bronchus is wider, it is shorter, and it is more vertically oriented. And this is the reason why if you aspirate an object, So an object goes into the respiratory tract and you choke from it, that object will often be found on the right bronchus. Why? Because it is wider, shorter, and straighter. So the object would tend to go there. The bronchi divide further into smaller conduits called bronchioles. And what's special about the bronchioles is that relative to the thickness of the wall of the respiratory tract, the bronchioles have the highest smooth muscle. Okay? And based on the contraction of that smooth muscle, the diameter that is for airflow varies. So if the smooth muscle contracts, the region where air can travel also decreases. The bronchioles feed air into the alveoli. So this is how the respiratory tree branches as it enters the lungs. So for example, at this portion, the right main bronchus has already entered the pulmonary hilum, and the further divisions of the right bronchus occurs within the lung. Okay? So you just appreciate how it branches. It is much like a tree, no? Para siyang puno. So that we often refer to the respiratory tract, the lower respiratory tract, as the tracheobronchial tree. The lungs occupy the entire thoracic cavity except for the most central area called the mediastinum, which is occupied by the heart. The narrow superior portion of the lung is called the apex, much like a pyramid, while its broad area resting on the diaphragm is its base. The left lung has 2 lobes, while the right lung has 3. And that is because the right lung has a horizontal fissure. The surface of the lung is covered by the visceral pleura, while the walls of the thoracic cavity are lined by the parietal pleura. And again, the pleural system is analogous to the pericardium, where you have a visceral pericardium and a parietal pericardium. So the lung also has a visceral pleura, which is directly on top of the lung, and a parietal pleura, which lines the thoracic cavity. This is a type of serosa, where in between the 2 layers of the pleura, between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura, you have pleural fluid. So this would be the anatomical relationships of the organs in the thoracic cavity. This is your trachea, and it will split into a right and left primary bronchus, which will further subdivide inside the lungs. This is your right lung, and this is your left lung. You will see here that the right lung is made up of 3 lobes, a superior, middle, and inferior lobe. And this is your oblique fissure, and this is your horizontal fissure. So the presence of the horizontal fissure on the right lung produces 3 lobes, whereas because your left lung only has the oblique fissure, it only has the superior lobe and the inferior lobe. And because the apex of the heart is directed towards the left, the majority of the heart muscle or volume is also directed towards the left, so that the left lung has to accommodate the heart and form this indentation called the cardiac notch, okay, which is the space occupied by the heart. This is your diaphragm. And as the diaphragm depresses or moves into its central tendon, it pulls on the pleura and the pleura pulls on the lung so that the lung is pulled inferiorly as the diaphragm depresses. Okay? So if we will take a closer look at this is your lung, visceral pleura, pleural space, and parietal pleura, which is found on the thoracic wall. This picture shows you how the microscopic bronchial tree divides and gives off the alveoli. Remember from our previous slides that gas exchange only occurs at the alveoli. So only structures which contain alveoli participate in gas exchange. So this is your terminal bronchiole, and the terminal bronchiole will give off respiratory bronchiole. So the respiratory bronchiole is also a conducting passage, but at the same time, because it already has within it, studded on its surface, alveoli, it will also participate in gas exchange. And the respiratory bronchiole will eventually terminally give the alveolar sac, which contains majority of the alveoli. So air will go here and it will interface with the blood through the capillary. And that is where gas exchange will occur. What you can see here would be holes on the walls of the alveoli, and these are your alveolar pores or alveolar pores of Kohn. So what does this do? It will cause equilibration of air in between alveoli so that the air from this alveoli can go into the other because of the pores. The air will pass through the pores. The external surfaces of the alveoli are covered by pulmonary capillaries. Together, the basement membrane of the uh, pneumoepithelium or the alveolar cell or pneumocyte, and the capillary walls, the endothelium of the capillary, comprise the respiratory membrane or the air-blood barrier, the air being found in the alveoli and the blood being found in the capillary. So this is how it looks like. As shown in the left, the respiratory membrane is composed of squamous epithelial cells of the alveoli or pneumocytes, the capillary endothelium, and the scant basement membrane in between. Because this basement membrane is very thin, gas exchange can occur between the blood and the air. Surfactant secreting cells, which are your pneumocyte type 2, are also shown. Small pores connect neighboring alveoli, and these are your pores of Kohn. As shown in the right, oxygen diffuses from the alveolar air across this membrane into the pulmonary capillary blood. Carbon dioxide diffuses from the pulmonary blood into the alveolus. So this is a zoom-in picture of the alveolus. And these are your type 1 cells or pneumocyte type 1. And these are your dust cells or macrophages. Okay, so they eat up the debris that has passed through the protective mechanisms from the upper respiratory tract. Remember that air from the upper to the lower respiratory tract as it reaches the alveoli is continuously being purified or filtered. So if there is particles or there are bacteria or pathogens that eventually are able to bypass those and reach the alveoli, it is the macrophage or the dust cell which engulfs them. Okay? These are your type 2 pneumocytes or surfactant secreting cells. And they make this soap-like material so that the alveoli can expand easily. Okay? Because the water that is present here lining the surface prevents the alveoli from expanding. So the production of surfactant by these cells will make the alveoli expand. So this is again your pneumocyte type 1, and relative to the blood vessel, the capillary that surrounds the alveoli, you will form the respiratory membrane. So this is the membrane made up of the alveolar cell or the pneumocyte type 1, the endothelial cell of the capillary, and their shared basement membrane. So together, this is your respiratory membrane. Oxygen, which is rich in the alveolus, goes into the blood, and carbon dioxide, which is rich in the blood, goes into the alveolus, which is eventually expired or exhaled. So the oxygen goes into the hemoglobin in the red blood cell, where it is carried to the different parts of the body. Now let's go into respiratory physiology. There are four distinct events or distinctive events which together make up the entire process of respiration. First is pulmonary ventilation, movement of air into and out of the lungs. This is also known as breathing. So this is your bulk flow of the air. Next would be external respiration. We term it external because it is still away from the peripheral cells of the body. And this includes gas exchange between the pulmonary blood and the alveoli, which occurs in the respiratory membrane. Next is respiratory gas transport. Transport of gases between the alveoli and the tissue cells via the red blood cells. And lastly, the oxygen that has been transported by the third phase of respiration eventually enters the peripheral cells of the body, where it is used for metabolic reactions. Gas exchange between the blood and the peripheral cells via the systemic capillaries. And again, the oxygen is used for metabolism to produce ATP. So, uh, the following slides will tell you the mechanics of breathing. So, first would be inspiration. Air flows into the lungs. And how does that happen? The diaphragm moves inferiorly during inspiration. And because the diaphragm is lined by the parietal pleura, and the parietal pleura is connected to the visceral pleura by a layer of fluid, by the diaphragm going inferiorly as it contracts, it will pull on the visceral pleura and it will pull on the entire lung so that the alveoli are stretched. The internal volume of the lung increases. And if the volume increases and the larynx superiorly is still closed, it will create negative pressure. So, that negative pressure, when the larynx opens or the vocal folds opens, you have positive pressure from the outside, from your ambient environment. The negative pressure inside your lungs, air will equilibrate. So air will move in from positive pressure to negative pressure in the lungs. And so as air moves in, inhalation or inspiration happens. Okay? This is supplemented by the action of the external intercostals. So as the external intercostals contract, the ribs are elevated. Okay, and so as the ribs are elevated, the diameter of the thorax increases from side to side as the ribs are elevated by the external intercostal muscles. Okay, so together with an increase in volume caused by the diaphragm, so the movement of the diaphragm increases the superior inferior distance or the vertical distance. The movement of the ribs care of the external intercostal increases the horizontal distance. So with an increase in vertical and horizontal distance, what happens? The thorax increases in volume. The lungs increases in volume. Together with the closed glottis, negative pressure occurs. Opening of the glottis, air moves in. Inhalation results. Next, this is what happens during expiration. The diaphragm goes back to its normal location and moves superiorly. The ribs, from being elevated, is depressed, and so the horizontal distance decreases. The anterior-posterior distance decreases, and the superior-inferior distance decreases. So the volume of the lungs and the thorax decreases, and that will increase the pressure inside the thorax, and that will cause air to move from high pressure inside the thorax to lower pressure outside in the ambient environment, and that will lead to exhalation. Again, air moves from high pressure to low pressure, from inside to outside, causing exhalation. So let's review that process. During inspiration, an increase in thoracic volume with an initially closed glottis or larynx creates negative pulmonary pressure. Upon opening of the glottis, ambient air rushes into the lungs to equalize the negative pressure inside. So that is the process of inspiration. During expiration, the recoil of the chest wall, because the chest wall is elastic, from being stretched, it goes back to its original state, okay, or tension. It causes intrapulmonary pressure to be higher than the surrounding and causes air to flow to the environment. So, during expiration, due to the recoil of the chest wall, the intrapulmonary pressure becomes more positive than the environment, and so when the glottis opens, air will rush from inside to the outside. So these are the changes in pressure during inspiration and expiration. As the diaphragm depresses, the intercostal muscles raise or elevate the ribs. The volume inside the lungs increases. Together with a closed glottis, the pressure becomes negative. Okay? And as the pressure becomes negative, upon opening of the glottis, air will rush in, and so the volume increases. And then expiration occurs, the diaphragm goes back to its normal position, the ribs are depressed, the pulmonary volume decreases, and so with a closed glottis, the pressure increases. Opening of the glottis causes air, which is inside the lungs, to equilibrate with the outside because of an increase in pressure. And so exhalation occurs, and the volume of the breath inside the body decreases. So inhalation, exhalation. Next, let's go into um, part 2 and part 3 of uh, the processes of respiration. And these are your transport and external respiration. So let's review how the pulmonary circulation occurs. Blood from the rest of the body, venous side, which is rich in carbon dioxide and low in oxygen, goes back to the right side of the heart, the right atrium, right ventricle, pulmonary artery, and goes into the lungs, where in the lungs it encounters alveolar air, which is rich in oxygen and poor in carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide goes into the alveoli and the oxygen goes into the blood. So after being exchanged, the blood gases are already high in oxygen and low in carbon dioxide. So they go back into the pulmonary veins, goes into the left atrium, left ventricle, and then the aorta, and then is delivered to the rest of the body, where transport occurs and oxygen then is delivered into the peripheral cells, utilized, and carbon dioxide is pumped from the cells into the blood, where it circulates again to go back to the lungs. Blood returning to the heart carries with it carbon dioxide. Red blood cells contain the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, which converts this carbon into carbonic acid by combining it with water. So again, from the cells, carbon dioxide will be released into the blood. In the blood, that carbon dioxide will be combined with water to form carbonic acid. And that is the state of carbon dioxide that is being carried by the red blood cells back into the lungs. In the lungs, the carbonic acid, which comes from the red blood cells, spontaneously decomposes into bicarbonate, which diffuses out of the red blood cells and combines with proton to reform carbonic acid extracellularly. So this process right here is how carbonic acid inside the red blood cell eventually is pumped out of the red blood cell and goes into the pulmonary epithelium or the pneumocyte. So it is just a process of moving the carbonic acid intracellularly into extracellular location. The carbon dioxide is reformed and diffuses into the alveoli. And then oxygen in the alveoli incorporates into hemoglobin, which carries it to the periphery. So let's recap that process. External respiration in the lungs. This is your pulmonary gas exchange. Oxygen is loaded into the blood and carbon dioxide is unloaded. First, let's look at how oxygen from the alveoli or air sacs diffuse through the membrane and go into the red blood cells, where it combines with hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin, which is eventually carried to the systemic circulation. However, the red blood cells also carry with it carbon dioxide from the periphery and transfers that carbon dioxide into the alveoli or air sacs. So the carbon dioxide is in the state of carbonic acid, H2 CO3. That carbonic acid decomposes into bicarbonate and proton. The bicarbonate goes out and combines with proton or hydrogen cation in the plasma to reform carbonic acid. But this time, you have to notice that the carbonic acid has transferred from inside the red blood cell to the outside. Carbonic acid then decomposes into carbon dioxide and water. And this carbon dioxide is the one that diffuses into the endothelium, into the respiratory membrane, and into the alveoli, where it is exhaled. Next, internal respiration. This is systemic capillary gas exchange. Oxygen is unloaded from the red blood cells and carbon dioxide is loaded into the blood. So, hemoglobin lets go uh, of its oxygen, or let goes of its oxygen, and oxygen diffuses into the membrane of the endothelium, into the microcirculation, and into the tissue cells, where the tissue cells will utilize the oxygen to produce ATP. But in the process of producing ATP, it will also produce carbon dioxide, which diffuses from the tissue cells into the microcirculation or interstitium and goes into the endothelium. Here, the carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid, and this process is catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase. That carbonic acid will spontaneously decompose into bicarbonate and proton, and the bicarbonate is taken up by the red blood cell and again converted inside the red blood cell into carbonic acid. So you will notice that this process is the opposite as what occurs in the pulmonary capillary. And so by this, carbon dioxide is able to piggyback itself on the red blood cell, where eventually it reaches the lungs and gets exhaled as carbon dioxide through this process. So here are my references for this lecture. Thank you for listening.